How do you follow global conspiracy theories and the NSA watching every single move? I guess you need to talk about electronic invoicing, really, don't you? Absolutely. Okay, so today, I've obviously been following the conversation today, and a lot of the conversation has been about identity and citizens. So I was sort of glad when John Bullard came up and started talking about the identity and authenticity of objects. Okay, because that's going to become increasingly important. And this section is obviously focusing on growth and opportunities. So I'm going to talk to you about one area that is very close to my heart, which is a growth business area, not just in the private sector, but increasingly in the public sector as well at the moment. And that is the very, very exciting world of electronic invoicing. I'm going to give you like a 2-minute 101 on what e-invoicing actually is, and then we'll look at how that relates to EID through authenticity and integrity, and talk a little bit about what's going on at the moment, what the challenges are, and what the opportunities are. So, why are companies interested in e-invoicing? Pretty simply, really, if you sort of look at the bottom line, it saves money. All we're really talking about here is a very humble document, and it's just taking the paper away and replacing it with an electronic version. It's as simple as that, okay? But there are a bunch of rules and regulations around e-invoices that make it a little bit more complex. But any company, issuing invoices to their customers or receiving invoices from their suppliers is actually going to take away all of that manual process and replace it with a very smooth electronic one. If you can imagine data coming in directly into an ERP, matching up to other reconciliatory documents such as purchase orders and shipping notices, and then pushing that through a payables process so the invoice is ready for payment, you can do it in under an hour. Do it with an electronic process, obviously instantaneously if it's straight through processing. With paper, if you can imagine large organisations, I can quote probably the UK's largest retailer, global company, you will use them. They're processing 1 million invoices a month. Okay, so a lot of effort is required to push paper through businesses. And these are all the reasons that these guys are looking in this area, reducing costs right up to 40% savings, invoice processing costs of 60 to 80%, automating processes, reducing cycle times, eliminating data entry, all the sort of very, very straightforward stuff, increasing prompt payment terms. Big issue with government at the moment is companies extending their days payable outstanding. So there's a new directive coming through, 2011-7 on late payments, and the ICM have got this thing called the Prompt Payment Initiative that Michael Fallon's backing. Is anybody familiar with that? Okay, yeah, so
15 years ago. It did, yes.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me. That's like this. Well, the original legislation came through then, and then they had a huge get-out clause that said, you don't have to sign up to this if you don't really want to. So the latest legislation is actually really tightening that down and saying that you have to sign up to this, and but you can extend your DPO as long as it's not grossly unfair. And then, of course, the Commission then goes on to not explain at all what grossly unfair actually means. So, yeah, absolutely. So the ICM, the FPB, the FSB, the BCC, and my group are actually working with Fallon on prompt payment, trying to sort of work out, companies always buy on credit. They've bought on credit for years. There's a great book called Debt that will explain the history of how we've all bought on credit forever and ever. It's just making sure that British businesses do it on fair and equitable terms. But more importantly is the British government has to do this in 30 days. That legislation forces the public sector to pay in 30 days. So that's why they're looking at e-invoicing and supply chain finance as an enabler to meet that legislation. I'm sorry?
Does it force the Commission as well, or does it the EU exempt themselves?
They haven't exempted themselves, and it's a good point because they're not exactly doing a lot about it. And going to Brussels, there's a lot of paper pushing around there. So, in fact, I tried to do my T&E, and it was all paper-based. So, yeah, it's hard work. And there's a lot of strategic value as well. I mean, if you're a supplier and you're giving electronic data to your customers, it does improve the customer experience, improves customer satisfaction. In fact, if you're going to do business in North America, you have to do some form of electronic data interchange, especially if you're going to go to JCPenney, Kmart, because they've got tons more messages than we got here. I've got a great case study in that particular area. It helps optimize working capital, and it makes cash management a more predictable process, right? So if you're working with this large retailer and you're sending paper, you're going to get paid in 45 to 60. But they're saying to you, actually, if you go electronic, we'll pay you in 30 or 25. So nice incentives because it helps both organisations. It also manages supply chain risk. It's data, there's transparency, we talked about big data, you guys know all about that, and corporate social responsibility. Okay, so what's happening is under Metcalfe's law, Reed's law, Beckstrom's law, we're building up these networks, there's value in the network, all of the trading parties are interconnected, therefore there's a huge network of buyer suppliers who know each other, therefore you want to be able to communicate to your supplier in Taiwan or whichever country it is that's low cost at that particular point in time. Are you adhering to all our ethical policies? Excuse me. And you can do that through the network. So there's a whole bunch of reasons to make it happen, but there are a whole bunch of regulatory requirements driving it as well. Why is the invoice so important, right? So it's just a piece of paper. VAT is very important to national GDP. It represents about a third of the UK GDP, and collection of VAT through the entire production cycle, all the way up to the consumer, is very, very important to HMRC. And it's not just important to us. VAT is the predominant indirect taxation method globally. Obviously, apart from a few obscure countries in the Middle East, Libya, maybe perhaps Saudi Arabia, and of course the United States of America. But it's a very, very important system. And yes, governments want everybody to go electronic because they recognise the benefits for business, and they also recognise the benefits for themselves. But they want a layer of diligence around it. So why is that important? Well, okay. If you're going to go to electronic invoicing, you have to make sure that you've legally issued the invoice, it's been technically issued, it's been legally received and technically received, and then it's got to be physically archived for an appropriate period of time. And then, when the auditor looks at your books at some point in the future, that could be at any point, there are a whole bunch of things you have to make sure you've got in place. And you need to be able to prove the elements that we've just described there, even if you've had organisational changes, if there's been process changes, system changes, or legal changes over that period of time. I've condensed that half-an-hour slide into 30 seconds there. But essentially we're talking about you have to prove the authenticity and integrity of the invoice. If you don't, then you have to pay back the VAT that you've reclaimed, and it's all on the buyer. Right, so we're talking about big companies with large ranges of VAT that potentially they might have to pay back at some point in the future because they haven't got their audit process in place. So this is where electronic signatures, digital signatures, whatever you want to call them, come into play, is they actually help prove the non-repudiability of the invoice itself. There are various means of doing that. You can actually do it within an electronic data interchange network. I can see the few people in the room probably remember EDI. Gets a bad press, does get a bad press. I've actually just moved from GXS, which is a big EDI company, into a new supply chain finance company. Before the internet, it was the only show in town, especially for B2B. It was the bulletin board. But those models are changing. Even those guys are moving their network into the cloud, and the value isn't in the physical connections anymore. It's in the business connections and the value that they can provide around the outside. So, but increasingly, those guys are competing with all these new trendy supply chain finance kind of guys, e-procurement guys who are marketplaces in the cloud. They leverage the internet. How do you prove authenticity and integrity of documents on the internet? Digital signatures is the way forward. So the British government is very, very keen at the moment. There's legislation coming through, new e-procurement directives. That means that they're going to have to do it by 2016 and implement it by 2016 and actually be fully adopted by 2020 as part of the digital agenda. There's legislation in place since 2010, since 2001, 2006, and recently 2010 that sort of describe the rules. But unfortunately, as happens with all European directives, they're interpreted uniquely in each individual country. So interoperability, which I think was mentioned earlier by Mark, is a big issue, especially with signatures, standards, don't talk to me about standards, and a whole range of other different issues. But there are big initiatives. This is a young market, which is why we've got it in the growth sector, right? It's below 16% penetration in Europe, but it's got a CAGR of 20%. You saw the figures there in terms of savings. My group, the UK National E-Invoicing Forum, has estimated that the British government will save between 4 and 6 billion annually if it adopts e-invoicing, e-procurement and supply chain finance. That's not a bad thing. That's less back office staff, I hate to say, but it's more lollipop ladies, nurses and police on the beat. So we're pushing that pretty heavily, and we've got a meeting with BIS on the 9th of December to talk specifically about the interoperability of networks and systems for e-procurement and e-invoicing. So there's a lot of impetus, there's a lot of scope, and there's a lot of potential for the assurance of the integrity of documents. And I think John put up a quick slide there about the sheer potential in the number of scope of documents, and that's only going to increase when the Internet of Things comes along.
So just to get what has to be done by 2020? I didn't quite pick up from what you said.
Oh, the legislation. You're going to pick me up on the legislation.
What exactly is that?
So the mandate has to be in place by 2016, and there's had to be a certain level of adoption by 2020. And I can't remember what it is off the top of my head.
So by 2020,
yeah.
a company somewhere in the UK.
No, the public sector. The public sector.
By 2020, some company in the UK will have to have received an electronic invoice from a public body of some description.
No, it's the other way around. We're talking about business to government, so we're talking about government supply chains. And the way it's working is that by 2016, if a private sector company offers an electronic invoice to government, any public sector institution in Europe, they will have to accept it.
Provided the invoice adheres to some super sector standards that...
Please don't talk to me about standards.
No, I'm just curious.
But yes, unfortunately, they're creating a brand new standard. In fact, it's a semantic layer, a semantic data model, that if the actual invoice adheres to that semantic layer, then yes, the government has to accept it.
And is this semantic layer in any way connected with what people like us remember as things like Edifact and... do these standards live on, or is this something being built from scratch?
It's XML based, it's UNCFAC, but it's stuff that already exists that certain people want to reinvent slightly in some different way. But there's a lot of people. I mean, I go to the Commission. I'm part of their current forum, and we do say to them, look, there are a bunch of existing standards. No point reinventing the wheel. Do what you're going to do, but make sure that you reuse what's already out there, because there's always a new standard, right? I mean, we had a German guy arguing with us, saying that's the sensible approach. Then when it was his turn to present, he was very excited to present the new German standard that he'd just invented, so what do you do?